Lucy Beckett had buried her father only 5 weeks before the stranger rode into Prairie Rose with a storm-gray gaze and a silence that spoke louder than most men's boasts. And though she did not know it yet, that silence would one day save her life. The autumn of 1878 had come hard to the Wyoming territory, the cottonwoods along the creek turning the color of old gold, the nights already carrying a bite that promised an early winter. Beckett Ranch sat in a wide bowl of grassland below the Bighorn foothills, 3,000 acres of good grazing that Silas Beckett had carved out of the wilderness 20 years before, back when the only law for 100 miles was a man's rifle and his word. He had built the house himself, log by log, and he had raised 2 children on that land after his wife died of a fever the winter Lucy turned 9. Now Silas was gone too, thrown from his horse chasing a stray bull into a rocky draw, his neck broken before Lucy even reached him. She had not cried in front of anyone since the funeral. She could not afford to. There was a ranch to run, 400 head of cattle to gather before the first snow. A 15-year-old brother named Tommy who looked at her now with the same lost eyes she saw in her own reflection, and a note at the Prairie Rose Trust and Loan Company that was going to come due, whether her father was alive to pay it or not. She stood on the porch that October morning with a cup of coffee going cold in her hands, watching the sun climb over the ridge, and she told herself the same thing she had been telling herself every morning since the funeral. She could do this. She had to. It was into this uncertain autumn that Louis Sutton came riding, a lean man of 28 years with sun-darkened skin, a scar along his jaw that he never explained, and a way of sitting a horse that told anyone who knew horses that he had spent more of his life in a saddle than out of one. He came up the long dirt track toward the ranch house on a rawbone bay gelding, leading a packhorse behind him, and he stopped a respectful distance from the porch and took off his hat before he spoke. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said. "I heard in town you might be needing hands for the fall gather. I can rope, I can break a horse that needs breaking, and I do not ask for wages I have not earned." Lucy studied him from the porch steps, arms crossed over her apron. She had already turned away 3 men that week, drifters who looked at her like she was a lamb wandering without a shepherd, men who assumed that because her father was dead and there was no husband on the property, the ranch was theirs for the taking if they only pushed hard enough. She did not think this man was cut from that cloth, but she had learned not to trust her first impression of anyone these days. "We had a foreman," she said. "He quit after my father passed. Said he did not think a woman could run a cattle operation, and I did not care to argue the point with him standing in my yard eating my food." Something that might have been the ghost of a smile crossed Louis Sutton's face. "I never had much use for a man who quits on a woman doing hard work," he said. "Seems to me the hard work does not care what is between a person's ears or under their skirts. It only cares whether the job gets done." Lucy's brother Tommy came around the side of the barn just then, wiping his hands on his trousers, and looked between the stranger and his sister with open curiosity. "You looking for the foreman job, mister?" "I am looking for any job that will keep a roof over my head and put a little silver in my pocket before the snow flies," Louis answered honestly. "I have worked cattle in Texas and Kansas and up along the Bozeman Trail. I scouted for the Army out of Fort Fetterman 2 years past, until I decided I liked keeping my own hours better than keeping the Army's." Lucy considered this. An ex-Army scout with cattle experience was worth more to her than any 3 drifters combined, and she had exactly 11 days before the bank note came due, and she needed every hand she could get to finish the gather and get cattle to the rail siding at Rock Creek for sale. Still, she was cautious. "I will give you a trial," she said. 2 weeks. You will answer to me, not to my brother, not to anyone else who might tell you different. If that arrangement does not sit right with you, there is no shame in riding on." Louis Sutton looked at her for a long moment, and there was nothing in his gaze but plain respect. "That arrangement sits just fine with me, Miss Beckett," he said, and swung down from his horse to shake her hand. his grip firm and his palm rough with old rope burns and honest work. That was how it began, though neither of them could have said on that first ordinary afternoon that it was the beginning of anything at all. The 2 weeks passed, and Louis Sutton did not once give Lucy cause to regret her decision. He rose before dawn and worked past dusk. He mended fence line that had been sagging since summer. He gentled a green-broke mare that had thrown every rider who tried her, using nothing but patience and a low, steady voice, until the animal followed him around the corral like a dog. He never complained, never argued when Lucy gave an order, and never once looked at her the way those other drifters had, like she was a puzzle to be solved or a prize to be won. He looked at her like she was simply the person in charge, and that, more than anything else, was what began to soften something in her that had gone hard and watchful since her father's death. Old Abel Crane, the one hand who had stayed on after Lucy Beckett's passing, a wiry man of 60 with 40 years of range work behind him, took to Louis Sutton almost immediately, which counted for something in Lucy's estimation. Abel did not warm to strangers easily. "That boy knows cattle," Abel told Lucy one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sun bleed orange over the western hills. "And he knows horses better than any man I have seen since I was young enough to still be surprised by things. But he has got sorrow in him somewhere, Miss Lucy. A man does not get a scar like that and a quiet like that from an easy life." "That is none of my business, Abel," Lucy said, though she found herself wondering about it more than she cared to admit. She learned pieces of it slowly, the way a person learns the shape of a room in the dark, by feeling her way along the edges. Louis had grown up in Missouri, the son of a blacksmith, and had gone west after the war between the states took his father and his older brother, leaving him the only man left to bury them both before he was 17 years old. He had drifted from Kansas to Texas to the territory, always working, never staying, until something about Prairie Rose and the wide gold country around it had made him slow his horse down for the first time in a decade. He learned pieces of her too, that her mother had died when Lucy was 9, of a fever that swept through the valley one hard winter and took 4 other women in the county besides, that her father had never remarried, had instead poured every ounce of himself into the ranch and into raising his 2 children as best a grieving man could. That Lucy had been keeping the ranch books since she was 14 years old because her father trusted her arithmetic more than his own, and that she could ride and rope as well as any man in the county, though she rarely got the chance to prove it because most men would not think to ask. "Wyoming territory gave women the vote 9 years back," Lucy told him one evening as they rode the fence line together, checking for breaks before the weather turned. "First place in the whole country to do it. I can cast a ballot same as any man in Prairie Rose. And yet Elias Crandall down at the Trust and Loan will not so much as look me in the eye across his own desk when I come in to discuss my father's note. Talks past me to Tommy, like a boy of 15 is more of a man than I am." "That does not seem right to me," Louis said quietly. "Seems to me the only thing that should matter is whether a person can do the work and keep their word. I have not seen anyone on this ranch keep their word better than you, Miss Beckett." Lucy glanced over at him, surprised by the plain sincerity in his voice, and found herself smiling for the first time in longer than she could remember. "You may call me Lucy, Mr. Sutton. Seeing as we have been mending fence together for 2 weeks now, I think we have earned that much informality." "Then you had best call me Louis," he said, "and I will try not to let it go to my head." That trial period ended, and Lucy did not hesitate to make the arrangement permanent. Louis Sutton became foreman of Beckett Ranch, and though neither of them spoke of it aloud, something had begun to grow between them in the long hours of shared work, something built not on stolen glances or flowery words, but on the steady accumulation of trust, the kind that comes from watching a person's character day after day and finding no cracks in it. The harvest dance in Prairie Rose came at the end of October, held in the town's one large barn belonging to the livery owner, who cleared out the stalls and strung lanterns from the rafters every year for the occasion. It was the sort of event the whole county turned out for, ranchers and homesteaders and townsfolk alike, a fiddle and a guitar providing the music, tables groaning under pies and cured hams brought by every woman within 20 miles. Lucy had not planned to attend. There was too much work, she told herself, too much grief still sitting heavy in her chest for dancing. But Tommy begged, and Abel insisted a person could not mourn forever without going a little mad from it. And so she found herself in her mother's old blue dress, her hair pinned up properly for the first time in weeks, standing at the edge of the barn watching couples turn beneath the lantern light. Louis Sutton found her there, looking uncharacteristically uncertain in a clean shirt that Abel had lent him, his hat in his hands. "I do not dance much," he admitted. "Never had much occasion to learn it proper, but I would consider it an honor if you would show me how it is done, Lucy." She laughed, a real laugh that surprised her with how easily it came, and took his hand. "It is not so difficult, Louis Sutton. You simply have to trust your partner not to let you fall." "I believe I can manage that," he said, and led her out onto the floor. They were clumsy together at first, his boots too large and unfamiliar with the steps, her laughter drawing curious looks from the matrons along the wall who whispered behind their fans about the Beckett girl and her new foreman. But by the third dance they had found a rhythm, and Lucy realized, somewhere in the golden lantern light with the fiddle singing and Louis's hand warm and steady at her waist, that she had not thought once about the bank note or the empty chair at her father's table or the weight of running a ranch alone. For the length of that dance, there was only the two of them, and the music, and a feeling in her chest she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time. Not everyone in Prairie Rose watched them with kindness that night. Elias Crandall, the banker, stood near the punch table with a man named Jasper Hollies, the owner of the Circle H, the largest cattle operation in the county, and the two of them watched Lucy and Louis dance with expressions that had nothing warm in them at all. "The Beckett girl thinks she can hold that land," Hollies said, swirling the punch in his cup without drinking it. 400 head and no man to run the operation but a drifter foreman with no roots in this county. "She will lose that ranch to the bank inside the year, Elias, and when she does, I intend to be the one who buys the note out from under you." "The father's note comes due in 11 days, Crandall said. "If she cannot make the payment, the bank forecloses, and I have already told you I would rather sell to you directly than see this drag through the territorial courts. But do not underestimate her, Jasper. She has kept those books cleaner than half the ranchers in this county, and she has got that Sutton fellow now stirring things up." Hollies' eyes narrowed as he watched Lucy laugh at something Louis said. Her face lit up in a way that made even a hard man like Jasper Hollies pause for half a moment before his ambition swallowed the pause whole. "Then perhaps," he said slowly, "we ought to make certain the gather does not go as smoothly as she hopes." Neither Lucy nor Louis heard this exchange, wrapped as they were in the small, bright world of the dance floor, but its consequences would find them soon enough. The trouble began 3 days later, when Abel rode in from the north pasture at a hard gallop, his face pale under his weathered tan. "Somebody has cut the fence along the Circle H boundary," he said, swinging down before his horse had fully stopped. "We are missing near 40 head, Miss Lucy. Tracks lead toward Holly's land, but they have been scattered on purpose, driven through the creek to break the trail." Lucy felt the floor of her stomach drop out. 40 head was money she could not afford to lose, not with the note coming due, not with winter breathing down the back of her neck. "Rustlers," she said, though even as she said it she wondered how much of a coincidence it truly was that the theft had come from the exact boundary shared with Jasper Hollies' ranch. Louis was already moving toward the barn, checking the load in his Winchester rifle with the calm efficiency of a man who had done such things before, in places far more dangerous than a Wyoming cattle range. I will ride out and see what I can find, he said. Abel, you stay with Lucy and Tommy. If someone is bold enough to cut fence in daylight, I do not like the idea of the house standing empty. I am coming with you, Lucy said immediately. Lucy. Louis turned to face her, and there was something in his eyes she had not seen before, a hard protective edge beneath the usual quiet warmth. If there are men out there willing to steal 40 head of cattle, they are not men I want you meeting without me at your side, and I cannot watch the trail and watch you both at once. Let me ride out with Abel's boy Danny. We will find the trail and we will find your cattle, and we will do it faster if I am not worrying after you the whole way. It was the first time he had ever told her not to do something, and Lucy felt an old, familiar stubbornness rise in her chest, the same stubbornness that had kept her running the ranch alone rather than accept charity or pity from any quarter. But she saw the sense in his words too, and more than that, she saw the fear underneath his insistence, fear for her safety rather than doubt in her ability, and that distinction mattered enough that she nodded. Go carefully, she said, and come back. I intend to, Louis said, and something passed between them in that moment that was not quite spoken but was understood all the same. He and Danny, Abel's 17-year-old grandson, rode out and returned 2 days later with 31 of the missing cattle, having tracked them to a hidden box canyon on the far edge of Circle H land, where they had clearly been driven and held, waiting, Louis suspected, for someone to alter their brands before selling them off at a rail siding 2 counties over. He could not prove Jasper Hollies had ordered it, not with the kind of proof that would satisfy a territorial judge, but he had no doubt in his own mind who was responsible. We cannot prove it, Louis told Lucy that evening, sitting across the kitchen table from her with a cup of coffee he had not touched, but I would wager my saddle that Hollies means to squeeze you until you cannot make the note, and then buy this ranch for a fraction of what it is worth. Crandall at the bank is likely more than willing to let it happen if it means the note gets settled either way. Lucy's jaw tightened. This land is my father's legacy. It is Tommy's inheritance. I will not hand it over to a man like Jasper Hollies, simply because he thinks a woman cannot hold what is rightfully hers. I know it, Louis said, and reached across the table to briefly, gently cover her hand with his own, and I do not intend to let him take it either. The days that followed took on a new urgency. The fall gather had to be finished, the cattle driven to Rock Creek and sold before the note came due, and every hand on the ranch worked from before dawn until well after dark to make it happen. Lucy rode alongside them, despite Louis's occasional worried glances, roping and driving cattle with a skill that silenced any lingering doubts among the hands about whether a woman belonged in a saddle doing a man's work. It was during these long, exhausting days that Lucy and Louis grew closer still, not through grand gestures, but through the 1,000 small moments that build a life between 2 people. The way he always made certain her horse was saddled before his own, the way she saved him the last of the biscuits at breakfast without being asked, the easy conversations that stretched late into the evening on the porch after Tommy had gone to bed, when they spoke of things neither of them had spoken of to anyone else. Louis told her, one such night, about his brother, about the war, about the years of drifting that had followed, always moving because staying still meant remembering too much. I did not think I would ever want to stay anywhere again, he admitted, the porch lantern throwing soft light across his face, until I rode into this valley and saw a woman standing on her own porch, refusing to be run off her own land by grief or by greedy men or by anyone at all. I have not wanted to leave since. Lucy's heart beat faster at that, though she tried to keep her voice steady. I am glad you did not leave, Louis Sutton. This ranch would have fallen apart twice over without you these past weeks. And she paused, searching for words that felt too large for her chest. I have not felt this much like myself again, not since before my father passed, until you came along and reminded me a person can grieve and still keep living. He looked at her for a long moment, the lantern light catching something raw and hopeful in his gray eyes, and neither of them moved to close the distance between them that night, though both felt the pull of it. There would be time, they told themselves, once the gather was finished and the note was paid and the ranch was safe. There would be time for everything else. They did not know, that quiet October night, how little time was truly left before the storm would test them both. The morning the storm came, the sky had already given warning of it for 2 days, a heavy stillness in the air, the cattle restless and unwilling to graze, the birds vanished from the cottonwoods along the creek. Abel, who had spent his whole life reading Wyoming weather, walked the yard that morning with a frown creasing his weathered face. "There is a bad one coming," he told Lucy over breakfast. "I can feel it in my knees, and I have not been wrong about that feeling in 30 years. We ought to bring the herd in close to the home pasture today. Get everyone inside well before dark." Louis agreed, and the day was spent in hard, hurried work, driving the scattered cattle in from the far pastures, checking every fence and gate, securing the barn doors against the wind that had already begun to pick up by mid-afternoon, gusting cold out of the northwest with a smell of rain and something colder underneath it. It was in the chaos of that afternoon that Tommy went missing. He had ridden out that morning before anyone else was awake, chasing after a half-dozen calves that had wandered from the home herd sometime in the night, determined to prove himself useful during the gather the way his sister and Louis were proving themselves every day. He had not told anyone where he was going, had simply saddled his pony and slipped away in the gray pre-dawn light, young and eager and utterly unaware of the storm building on the horizon. By 4 in the afternoon, with the sky turning the color of a bruise and the wind howling steady out of the northwest, Lucy realized her brother was not among the hands gathered in the yard. "Where is Tommy?" she asked Abel, her voice sharp with a fear that had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with a boy of 15, who had never once given her real cause to worry before now. "I have not seen him since this morning, Miss Lucy," Abel said, and the concern on his weathered face mirrored her own. "Danny said he saw him riding out toward the North Creek bottoms before sunup, after those wandering calves." The North Creek bottoms were a maze of ravines and dry washes that ran with dangerous speed whenever heavy rain fell in the hills above, arroyos that could fill with a wall of water in a matter of minutes during a hard storm, sweeping away anything caught in their path. Lucy had grown up hearing stories of cattle and even men lost to flash floods in those very bottoms, and the thought of her brother out there alone, with a storm bearing down that promised to be the worst of the season, sent ice through her veins. Louis came striding across the yard just then, having heard the exchange, his face already set with grim purpose. "How long has he been gone?" "Since before dawn," Lucy said, already moving toward the barn where her own horse stood saddled from the morning's work. "I am going after him, Lucy." Louis's voice was firm, and he caught her arm gently but insistently before she could swing up into the saddle. "Look at that sky. That storm is going to break within the hour, maybe less, and once it does, those creek bottoms are going to be a death trap. I'm not saying we do not go after Tommy. I'm saying you cannot ride out alone in a storm like the one that is coming. If your horse throws you, if lightning spooks the animal, if the creek rises while you are crossing it, there will be no one to help you. I will not let you go alone." "Then come with me," Lucy said, her eyes bright with fear and determination in equal measure. "But we are not waiting. Every minute we stand here arguing is a minute my brother is out there alone." "I am not arguing that we should not go," Louis said. "I am telling you that I need 5 minutes to gather rope and blankets and get Abel organized to hold down things here, and I need you to wait those 5 minutes so we ride out together, not so you go tearing off ahead of me into a storm that could kill you both. Please, Lucy, 5 minutes." But Lucy Beckett had spent her whole life being the one who acted while others deliberated, and the thought of her little brother alone in those ravines with a storm closing in was more than she could bear to sit still for, not even for 5 minutes. She looked at Louis, saw the fear and the plea in his eyes, and felt something in her chest tear at the thought of defying him. But her brother's face rose up in her mind, Tommy as a small boy clinging to her hand at their mother's funeral, Tommy laughing at her jokes over supper just the night before, and she could not make herself wait. "I am sorry, Louis," she said, and swung up into the saddle before he could stop her. "I cannot wait 5 minutes, not for Tommy." "Lucy, do not do this." But she was already turning her horse toward the North Creek bottoms, spurring the animal into a hard gallop across the yard, her braid whipping loose in the rising wind, and Louis Sutton was left standing in the yard with his heart pounding, and a fear colder than the coming storm settling into his bones. He did not waste breath cursing her stubbornness, though it flared hot and fast through him for the space of one heartbeat. He simply turned and ran for the barn, calling over his shoulder to Abel, "Get the men to secure the herd and the house. If we are not back by full dark, ride for Prairie Rose and bring back whoever you can find willing to help search." He was in the saddle within 2 minutes, his own horse fresh and strong, a coil of rope at his saddle horn, a blanket rolled and tied behind the cantle, his rifle in its scabbard more from habit than any expectation of needing it against anything but the storm itself. He set out after Lucy at a hard gallop, the first fat drops of rain already beginning to fall, cold as melted snow, the sky overhead churning black and violet with the promise of the storm's full fury still to come. The rain came on in earnest within 20 minutes, first in sheets driven sideways by a wind that howled across the open grassland with a sound like a living thing in pain, then giving way to a downpour so heavy that Louis could barely see 50 feet ahead of his horse's ears. Lightning split the sky in jagged white cracks, thunder rolling across the plains in waves that made the ground itself seem to tremble, and Louis Sutton pressed his horse onward through the deepening mud and the blinding rain, following the only trail he could. The fading hoofprints of Lucy's horse pressed into the softening earth before the rain washed even those away. He found her nearly an hour later, in the worst of it, at the edge of the largest of the North Creek ravines, and what he found nearly stopped his heart. Lucy's horse stood trembling and riderless at the top of the ravine, its reins caught in a tangle of sagebrush, clearly having thrown its rider when a crack of lightning struck a lone cottonwood not 30 yards distant, the tree still smoking faintly even in the pouring rain. Louis's blood ran cold as he swung down from his own mount and scrambled to the edge of the ravine, calling her name into the wind and rain and getting no answer but the roar of water below, where the dry creek bed had already become a churning brown torrent, rising with terrifying speed. "Lucy." His voice cracked with a fear he had never felt in all his years of scouting through hostile country, through skirmishes and stampedes, and every danger the frontier had thrown at him. "Lucy, answer me." And then, faint over the storm, he heard it. A voice, calling back, not from the ravine floor where the flood churned, but from a rocky outcropping some 15 feet down the steep bank, where a narrow ledge of stone jutted out just above the rising water line. Lucy had been thrown from her horse when it spooked at the lightning strike, tumbling partway down the bank before catching herself on that ledge, and now she clung there, soaked to the bone, one arm cradled awkwardly against her body, the flood waters rising steadily below her with every passing minute. "Louis." Her voice was hoarse with cold and fear, but it was unmistakably alive, unmistakably her, and relief crashed through him so powerfully his knees nearly buckled. "Louis, I cannot climb up, my arm is hurt, and the water. I see you, I am coming." He shouted back, already uncoiling the rope from his saddle horn with hands that shook, whether from cold or fear he could not say. He tied it fast around a sturdy boulder at the ravine's edge, tested the knot with his full weight, and then began working his way down the slick, muddy bank toward her, the rain lashing at his face, thunder cracking so close overhead that the sound seemed to come from inside his own skull. It took him agonizing minutes to reach her, minutes in which the water below rose another foot, close enough now that its cold spray reached the ledge where Lucy huddled. When he finally got a hand on her, gripping her good arm and pulling her against his chest on that narrow shelf of stone, he felt her trembling from cold and shock and the sheer terror of what had nearly happened, and he held her there for one long moment, his heart hammering against his ribs. "I have got you," he said into her wet hair, his voice rough with emotions he did not try to hide any longer. "I have got you, Lucy. I am not letting go." "Tommy," she gasped, even through her own pain and fear, her first thought still for her brother. "We have to find Tommy." "We will," Louis said. "But first I am getting you off this ledge before that water climbs any higher. Can you use your good arm to hold the rope?" She nodded, teeth chattering, and together, with Louis half carrying and half guiding her, using every ounce of strength and skill his years in the saddle and in dangerous country had given him, they climbed the muddy bank back to level ground, the flood waters rising to swallow the very ledge where she had been huddled only minutes after they left it. There was no possibility of continuing the search in that storm, not with Lucy's arm clearly injured, likely broken or badly sprained, and not with the lightning still cracking dangerously close, and the light fading fast toward a black, storm-choked evening. Louis knew of an old line shack a half-mile distant, built by a trapper years before and used since by ranch hands checking the north pastures, and he half-carried Lucy there, leading both horses behind him through the storm, until they stumbled through the low doorway into a single dim room that smelled of dust and old wood smoke but was blessedly, gloriously dry. He got a fire going in the small stone hearth with hands still shaking from cold and fear, using dry kindling from a stack left by some previous occupant, and once the flames caught and began to throw warmth into the small room, he turned his attention to Lucy, who sat huddled in the one corner not touched by a leak in the roof, her wet hair plastered to her face, her injured arm cradled against her chest. "Let me look at that arm," he said gently, kneeling beside her. She let him, wincing as he carefully examined it, running gentle fingers along the length of her forearm. "I do not think it is broken," he said after a moment, relief plain in his voice. "Badly sprained, maybe, or a small fracture, but the bone is not badly displaced that I can feel. We will get it properly looked at by Doc Hale once we are back in Prairie Rose. For now, we need to get you warm and dry, or the cold will do you more harm than that arm ever could." He found a spare blanket rolled behind an old cot in the corner, dusty but dry, and wrapped it around her shoulders before adding more wood to the fire. Lucy watched him work in the firelight, her whole body still trembling, though whether from cold or from the lingering terror of the flood waters rising toward her, she could not entirely say. "You should not have come after me," she said quietly, once the fire had built to a steady warmth and some of the shaking had begun to ease. "You could have been killed riding out in that storm, Louis. I never should have." Her voice broke, and she pressed her good hand against her eyes. "I am sorry. I should have waited for you. I have never been so frightened in my life, not even when my father died, and it was my own stubbornness that put me on that ledge." Louis moved to sit beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched, and after a moment's hesitation, he reached out and gently pulled her hand away from her face so he could look at her properly. "I told you not to ride out alone," he said, and there was no anger in his voice, only a rawness that matched her own. "And you did it anyway because you love your brother more than you feared the storm. I cannot be angry at you for that, Lucy, even though it near stopped my heart when I found that ledge and did not hear your voice right away. I do not think I have ever been more afraid of anything in my whole life, more afraid than I ever was in the war, more afraid than any skirmish I rode through scouting for the army. The thought of losing you." He stopped, his voice catching, and in the firelight Lucy saw something in his gray eyes that she had been hoping, for weeks now, to see. "Louis," she whispered. "I saddled up because I could not do anything else," he said. "I could not have stayed in that yard, Lucy, not knowing you were out here alone. I do not think I could survive it, watching something happen to you and knowing I did nothing to stop it. I have lost people before. I do not intend to lose you too, not if there is breath left in my body to prevent it." She reached out with her good hand and touched his jaw, tracing the line of the old scar there, and he closed his eyes at the touch, leaning into it like a man starved for exactly this kind of tenderness. "I have been falling in love with you for weeks now," Lucy admitted, the words coming easier now than she had ever imagined they might, perhaps because the storm and the flood and the terror of the day had stripped away whatever reserve she might otherwise have clung to. "I did not know how to say it. I was afraid, after my father, after everything, that I did not have room left in my heart for anything but grief and worry. But you have shown me these past weeks that a person can grieve and still find room to love again. I love you, Lucy Beckett," Louis said simply, the words plain and unadorned, but carrying more weight than any flowery speech could have managed. "I have loved you since I watched you stand on that porch and refused to let a dead foreman's doubts run you off your own land. I think some part of me knew it even then, though it took a flood and a storm to make me brave enough to say it out loud." He kissed her then, gently, mindful of her injury, mindful of the cold and the exhaustion still clinging to both of them, and Lucy melted into it with a relief that felt like coming home after a long, hard journey. Outside, the storm raged on, thunder rolling across the plains, rain hammering the shack's tin roof, but inside that small, fire-lit room, something had settled between them that no storm could ever wash away. They stayed the night in the lined shack, Louis keeping the fire fed while Lucy dozed fitfully against his shoulder, her arm bound in a makeshift sling made from strips torn from the spare blanket. Neither of them slept deeply, worry for Tommy gnawing at both of them even in the warmth of their newfound understanding. But by the time gray dawn light began to filter through the shack's single grimy window, the storm had passed, leaving behind a washed, clean sky and a landscape transformed by mud and swollen creeks. They found Tommy an hour after sunup, exactly as Louis had privately hoped they might. The boy had had the good sense, once the storm broke, to seek shelter in a shallow cave along the ravine wall, a spot he and Lucy had explored together as children years before, and he had spent the night there, cold and frightened, but entirely unharmed, having managed to keep his pony sheltered under a rocky overhang nearby. He came stumbling out when he heard his sister's voice calling across the ravine, and the reunion, tearful and fierce, brought all three of them together in a tangle of relief and gratitude that needed no words to express its depth. "I am sorry, Lucy," Tommy said, his voice small and ashamed as they rode back toward the ranch house in the clean morning light. "I did not think about the storm until it was already on top of me. I just wanted to help with the gather. I wanted to prove I was not just a boy anymore." "You do not have to prove anything to me, Tommy," Lucy said, reaching over despite her sore arm to squeeze her brother's shoulder. "You are my brother, and I love you, and I would rather have you safe and unproven than lost trying to be something you already are in my eyes, without needing to prove it at all." They rode into the ranch yard to find Abel and the other hands already gathered, having spent an anxious night watching for their return, and the relief that swept through the yard when all three riders came into view, tired and mud-streaked but whole, was palpable. Word spread through Prairie Rose within the day, of the storm and the flood and how Louis Sutton had ridden out after Lucy Beckett and pulled her from a rising flash flood with his own hands. And the story, told and retold in the saloon and the general store, and after church services that following Sunday, began to shift something in the way the town looked at both of them. Doc Emmett Hale confirmed Lucy's arm was a bad sprain rather than a fracture, bound it properly, and told her firmly to keep it in a sling for at least 3 weeks, an instruction Lucy accepted with far more grace than anyone who knew her stubbornness might have expected, though privately she suspected it had something to do with the way Louis had not left her side since the storm, fussing over her in a way that made her laugh even as it warmed her heart. But the danger to the ranch had not passed with the storm. If anything, the note coming due at the bank loomed larger now that Lucy could not use her injured arm fully for the final push of the gather, and Jasper Hollies, hearing the story of the flood and the rescue along with everyone else in the county, saw in it not romance but opportunity. "The girl is weakened," he told Elias Crandall 3 days after the storm, the two men meeting in the back room of the bank with the shades drawn against prying eyes. Her arm is injured, her brother nearly drowned, and if the gather is not finished and those cattle are not sold at Rock Creek within the week, she will not make the note payment. I want to know the moment that happens, Elias. I intend to have my offer on your desk before the ink is dry on the foreclosure notice. There is decency to consider, Jasper, Crandall said, though even he seemed to know the protest was weak. The whole town is talking about that Sutton fellow riding into the storm after her. People are calling it the most romantic thing to happen in this county in years. If it comes out that you tried to profit from her misfortune, people's romantic notions do not pay this bank's overhead, Holly said flatly. You know as well as I do that note has been due since her father's passing, extended only out of some misplaced sentiment on your part. I am not asking you to break any law, Elias. I am asking you to follow the terms of the contract, exactly as written, the same as you would for any rancher in this county, man or woman. It was a hollow argument, dressed up in the language of fairness while serving only greed, and both men in that room knew it, though neither said so aloud. But Elias Crandall, weak-willed and more concerned with his own comfortable position than with any genuine principle, agreed to Holly's terms, and the two men shook hands on an arrangement that would, if it succeeded, strip Lucy Beckett of everything her father had built. Word of the scheme reached Louis Sutton through an unlikely source, the bank's own young clerk, a earnest boy named Peter Ackers who had grown up admiring Silas Beckett and who had overheard enough of the conversation through a poorly sealed door to understand the shape of what was being planned. He rode out to the ranch that same evening, finding Louis in the barn checking horses' hooves by lantern light, and delivered his warning in a low, nervous voice. They mean to call the note the moment it is due, Mr. Sutton. No grace period, no discussion. And Mr. Holly's already has his offer prepared to buy the note out from the bank the same day, cash in hand, before Miss Beckett has any chance to raise the money elsewhere. I do not think it is right, sir, but I did not know who else to tell. You did exactly right telling me, Peter, Louis said, gripping the boy's shoulder in gratitude. I will make certain no harm comes to you for it. He found Lucy in the kitchen, going over the ranch books by lamplight despite her still healing arm, and told her everything the young clerk had shared. Her face went pale, but her jaw set with the same determination Louis had come to know so well. How many days until the note is due? She asked. 6, Louis said. The gather is nearly finished, but we still need to drive the herd to Rock Creek and get a fair price at the rail siding, and even then I am not certain the sale alone will cover the full note, not after the cattle we lost to Holly's rustling. Then we drive them tomorrow, Lucy said, already rising from the table despite the late hour. Every head we have got, and we do not stop until we reach Rock Creek. The cattle drive that followed was one of the hardest few days Lucy Beckett had ever lived through, made harder still by her healing arm, which she refused to favor despite Louis's repeated concern. They pushed the herd across 25 miles of open range in 2.5 days, sleeping in short shifts, eating cold food in the saddle, watching the herd through storms of dust kicked up by hundreds of hooves, all while knowing every hour that passed brought the note's deadline closer. They reached Rock Creek's rail siding on the evening of the 5th day, with barely more than 24 hours to spare, and the cattle buyer there, a gruff but fair man named Otis Grimm who had known Silas Beckett for 15 years, gave them a solid price for the herd, enough, when combined with what savings Lucy had managed to set aside, to cover the note in full with a small margin left over. But when Lucy and Louis rode into Prairie Rose the following morning to settle accounts at the bank, they found Jasper Holly's already there, standing in the lobby with an air of a man who believed he had already won, a folded bank draft visible in his coat pocket. Miss Beckett, Holly said, his tone dripping with false courtesy. I had heard rumors your gather was going poorly, what with your injury and all. I have come prepared with a fair offer for your ranch. Should you find yourself unable to meet your obligations to Mr. Crandall this morning." Lucy walked past him without so much as a glance, her chin lifted, her injured arm held with quiet dignity in its sling, and set a heavy leather satchel on Elias Crandall's desk. "I believe you will find the full amount of my father's note within, Mr. Crandall, plus the accrued interest through this date. I would appreciate a receipt marking the note as paid in full." Crandall's face went through several complicated expressions before he finally, with obviously reluctant fingers, counted the money and confirmed the total was correct. "The note is satisfied, Miss Beckett," he admitted, unable to meet either her eyes or Jasper Hollies' furious glare. "The Beckett ranch is free of encumbrance." Hollies' composure cracked at last. "This is absurd. A woman managing 400 head of cattle without a proper foreman." "I have a foreman," Lucy said, turning to face him directly for the first time, her voice steady and clear enough to carry through the small bank lobby. "Mr. Louis Sutton has managed this ranch's operations with more skill and integrity than any man I have ever known, present company included, Mr. Hollies. And I would remind you that cutting a rancher's fence and rustling their cattle is a crime in this territory, regardless of how large your own operation might be. I have not forgotten the 40 head that went missing from my north pasture 5 weeks past, and I do not believe I am the only one in this county who might find it interesting to know exactly whose brand appeared, however clumsily altered, on cattle recovered from a hidden canyon on Circle H land." The color drained from Hollies' face. He had not expected such direct accusation, delivered so calmly and in front of witnesses, including Crandall himself, and he understood immediately the danger of the position he had put himself in. Rustling was a hanging offense in some parts of the territory, and though Prairie Rose was not so lawless as some cattle towns further south, the accusation alone, spoken aloud in a public bank lobby, was enough to do serious damage to a man's standing and business dealings. "I have no idea what you are implying, Miss Beckett," Hollies managed, though his voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. "I am not implying anything, Mr. Hollies," Lucy said. "I am simply stating facts, and I trust the territorial marshal, when he next passes through Prairie Rose, will find them as interesting as I do. Good day to you." She turned and walked out of the bank with Louis at her side, and it was only once they were outside, standing in the bright morning sun on the wooden sidewalk, that the tension broke and Lucy allowed herself to laugh, a bright, relieved, slightly incredulous sound. "Did you see his face, Louis? I do not believe Jasper Hollies has ever in his life been spoken to that way by anyone, let alone a woman he assumed was too weak to fight back." "I saw it," Louis said, grinning at her with open pride. "And I have never been more proud of anyone in my life, Lucy Beckett. You did that, every bit of it, on your own strength." "Not entirely on my own," she said softly, taking his hand there on the street, uncaring who might see. "I do not think I would have made it through this month, through any of this, without you beside me, Louis Sutton." Word of Jasper Hollies' rustling scheme did indeed reach the territorial marshal, a stern, fair-minded man named Bill Coburn, who rode through Prairie Rose 2 weeks later on his regular circuit. He investigated the matter thoroughly, interviewing Louis and Abel and several of the Circle H's own hands, some of whom, once questioned directly under oath, admitted with obvious relief to having been ordered by Hollies' segundo to alter brands on cattle they knew to be stolen. Hollies himself was arrested, and unable to buy his way out of clear evidence and multiple witness testimonies, was eventually tried and convicted at the territorial court in Cheyenne, sentenced to 5 years in the territorial prison, his ranch sold at auction to settle debts and restitution owed to Lucy Beckett and 2 other smaller ranchers who had suffered similar losses over the preceding 2 years. Elias Crandall, disgraced by his willing participation in the scheme, was quietly removed as manager of the Prairie Rose Trust and Loan Company by its owners out of Cheyenne, replaced by a far more even-handed man who, in the years that followed, would extend fair credit to ranchers regardless of whether they wore trousers or skirts to conduct their business. With the immediate threats to the ranch resolved, the winter that followed was, for the first time in longer than Lucy could remember, a season of peace rather than survival. Snow fell deep and steady across the Wyoming range, and the ranch house at Beckett Ranch, once so quiet and grief-stricken, filled again with warmth and laughter, Tommy recovering fully from his ordeal and growing closer to Louis with each passing week, looking up to him now not merely as a foreman but as something closer to family. It was on Christmas Eve, with snow falling soft and silent outside the windows, and a fire crackling in the hearth where Silas Beckett had once told his children stories on winter nights, that Louis Sutton knelt before Lucy Beckett and asked her to be his wife. "I do not have much to offer you, Lucy," he said, holding a small, simple ring that had belonged to his own mother, one of the only possessions he had carried with him through all his years of drifting. "I have no land of my own, no great fortune, nothing but my 2 hands and whatever wages a foreman's job pays. But I have loved you since before I knew how to say it, and I do not believe I will ever love anyone the way I love you, not if I live 100 years. I saddled up and followed you into a storm because I could not imagine a world where I did not try to protect you, and I would ride into 1,000 more storms if it meant getting to spend my life at your side. Will you marry me, Lucy Beckett?" Lucy, tears bright in her eyes, did not hesitate for even a moment. "You have offered me everything that matters, Louis Sutton, a steady heart, an honest hand, and a love I did not believe I would find again after losing my father. Yes, yes, I will marry you, 1,000 times yes." They were married the following spring, in May of 1879, in a ceremony held in the yard of Beckett Ranch beneath a sky scrubbed clean and blue after a gentle overnight rain, the whole of Prairie Rose turning out to celebrate. From Abel Crane, who gave away the bride alongside Tommy since Lucy had no living father to do so, to Doc Hale, to Peter Ackers, the young bank clerk whose honesty had helped save the ranch, to Otis Grimm, the cattle buyer, who had given them a fair price when it mattered most. The preacher spoke of storms weathered and love found in unexpected places, and when Louis Sutton kissed his bride before the assembled crowd, there was not a dry eye among the ranchers and homesteaders and townsfolk gathered to witness it. Lucy Beckett became Lucy Sutton that day, though she kept the Beckett name in her heart always, a tribute to the father who had built the ranch and the mother who had died too soon to see her daughter find such happiness. Louis moved into the main house properly then, no longer merely the foreman's quarters but a true partner in every sense, and together they ran Beckett Ranch through the years that followed with a steady hand and an honest heart that earned them the respect of the entire county. Tommy grew into manhood under Louis's steady guidance, eventually taking over much of the ranch's daily operations himself once he came of age, freeing Lucy and Louis to expand their holdings with the additional grazing land purchased, fairly and honestly, from the auction of Jasper Hollis's forfeited Circle H Ranch, a fitting irony that was not lost on anyone in Prairie Rose. Their first child, a son, was born in the spring of 1880, a healthy, loud-voiced boy they named Silas, after Lucy's father, with gray eyes that matched his own father's and a stubborn set to his jaw that made Abel Crane laugh and declare the boy would give them both plenty of trouble before he was grown. 2 years later came a daughter, whom they named Grace, for Louis's mother, a bright, curious child who grew up chasing her older brother across the same grasslands where her mother had once fought so hard to keep her inheritance whole. A third child followed some years after, another son they named Abel, in honor of the old ranch hand who had stood by Lucy through the darkest days after her father's death, and who lived long enough to bounce his namesake on his knee before passing peacefully in his sleep at the age of 74, mourned by the whole family as one of their own. Beckett Ranch, in the years that followed, became one of the most respected cattle operations in that part of the Wyoming Territory. And later the state of Wyoming, once statehood came in 1890, known not only for the quality of its herds, but for the fairness with which Louis and Lucy Sutton treated every hand who worked for them and every neighbor who did business with them, regardless of whether that neighbor was a wealthy rancher or a struggling homesteader just starting out. Lucy, remembering all too well what it had felt like to be dismissed and underestimated because of her sex, made certain that any woman who came to their ranch seeking honest work or fair credit for cattle found a welcome she herself had once been denied elsewhere. On quiet evenings, when the work was done and the children were tucked into their beds, Lucy and Louis would often sit together on the same porch where he had first ridden up all those years before, watching the sun set gold and red over the Bighorn foothills. And sometimes, when a storm rolled through in the distance, its thunder rumbling low across the plains, Louis would reach for Lucy's hand without needing to be asked, and she would lean into his shoulder. And neither of them needed to say aloud what they were both remembering. The storm that had once nearly taken everything from them had instead given them everything that mattered most, a love tested by fire and flood and greed and grief, and proven in the end unbreakable. Lucy Beckett Sutton lived out the rest of her long life on that same ranch, surrounded by children and eventually grandchildren, never once regretting the stubborn ride into the storm that had, in its own strange and terrifying way, brought her the truest love she would ever know. And Louis Sutton, the quiet drifter who had once told her not to ride out alone, never stopped being grateful every single day of his life that he had saddled up and followed her anyway, into that storm and into every storm that came after, for as long as they both should live.